Welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naimon, your host, and today's guest is China Miéville, the acclaimed writer of such works as Perdido Street Station, The Scar, and The City in the City. China Miéville's books have won the British Science Fiction Award, the Arthur C. Clarke Award, the World Fantasy Award, and the Hugo Award, and he's here today to talk about his new, much-anticipated book, Embassytown. Welcome to Between the Covers, China.
Thanks for having me.
Well, maybe we can start by orienting our listeners to the scenario or the world that you've created with Embassytown.
Sure. Basically, it's a story that's set far in the future. It's set on an alien planet, which is kind of a galactic backwater. It's kind of, the sticks, really, in space. And it's about a kind of very isolated human colony living among some very strange aliens called the Ursula K, or the hosts. And then it goes into various kind of ruminations about language, and there's a political upheaval and a war and an apocalypse and all kinds of stuff around that kind of that basis of this isolated colony.
What's really fascinating when you mention the issue of language, we have a lot of really bizarre and compelling obstacles between the humans and the hosts in terms of how they can speak to each other. And when I think of a lot of dystopian books around the fate of books or the fate of literature, and you think of like Brave New World or Fahrenheit,
451.
451,
right.
And you think even lately, Super Sad True Love Story about a time when nobody's reading. Here we have sort of the opposite. We have where language has become so important to the survival of both species in a sense. Can you talk about whether that was a conscious choice on your part?
Well, I'm very interested in questions of kind of language philosophy and so on. So I wasn't. It's interesting that analogy you make, that comparison. I wasn't thinking in terms of the kindless, the kind of Jeremiads about the end of reading and the end of books and so on, which I always treat with immense skepticism. I have to say, I don't think reading's dying out. I don't think it's going to die out. I don't think books are going to die out. That complaint seems to me to be more a kind of cultural symptom of something else than a kind of rigorous prognostication. But what I was very interested in was, as I say, language philosophy and symbology and semiotics and that sort of thing. And so I was just kind of riffing off the idea of there being two species that have, that appear to each other to be communicating in roughly the same way with something that they call language, but are actually doing something completely philosophically different, are relating their words, themselves, and the world in two absolutely radically opposed ways, so that all the communication that goes on is actually a kind of a misunderstanding in a way. And I just really liked that idea. And the advantage of fiction in general and science fiction in particular is you can kind of play around with these quite abstract ideas and kind of embed them in a sort of literalized landscape. So have them at the same time as a kind of alien apocalypse novel. So there are various kind of discussions about how language works and how language might work and so on in the book, because that kind of thing was of great interest to me.
And when you talk about two species with thinking they're communicating, but actually there's a mutual misunderstanding, that reminds me of your book, The City in the City, a little bit, in terms of two cities superimposed and both cultures can't really see each other. And I was wondering if that is a reoccurring place of interest for you, this threshold space or this liminal space where there's a sense of disconnect, but also a sense of mystery between two different peoples or two different species.
I guess, to some extent, sure. And I think probably, I honestly think that that's one of those things that someone like me is going to be the worst person to judge what's going on. I think that writers are often, the last people to see the threads between various bits and pieces that they're doing. Certainly that question of kind of where one border begins and another ends, and these kind of porous, interstices and so on, is something I've always been interested in, no question. In terms of the question of kind of misunderstanding, I would make a distinction between the misunderstandings that go on in Embassytown are much more actually to do with, utterly contradictory philosophies. It's as if two completely contradictory sets of physics impossibly coexist in the same universe. Whereas in The City and the City, it felt to me much more like a kind of extrapolation of the social logic of the world around us, kind of exaggerated to a sort of slightly grotesque degree. So there are connections, but I think there are probably at least as many differences as there are connections. That's my intuition anyway.
Well, with the language obstacles in the Embassytown, and one of the obstacles being that the hosts themselves can't actually say something that isn't true. And I was wondering if there was some connection, and you have an epigram from Walter Benjamin at the beginning, if that goes back to the story of Genesis at all. The idea that before people could conceive of an alternate reality when they're in the Garden of Eden, they also couldn't, they had no self-consciousness, they had no imagination in a sense, but they also didn't have the capacity to sin or to do something morally wrong. Yes. I mean, very simply, as I think the Walter Benjamin quote flags quite kind of enthusiastically, I'm not trying in this novel. I was, as I said, I was very interested in language, but not so much in kind of rigorous sociolinguistics as in a more abstract kind of philosophy of language, which does indeed dovetail with theological arguments about the whole question of the fall and consciousness, the tree of knowledge, all that sort of thing. Those things are definitely there for me, and quite explicitly and quite consciously, and indeed are referenced in the novel. But I'm slightly, as always, slightly nervous of sort of implying that the book is kind of relies on an enthusiastic understanding of that to work. I mean, you have to make the fiction work as a story in its own terms. So for readers that have no interest at all in such kind of biblical notions, or in some ways almost kind of Gnostic notions, there is also, I would hasten to reassure that there is also zap guns and alien fights aplenty, you know what I mean? And that's what you can do in fiction. You can have that both ways. I think that's actually a really good point that you make, because that is what I think is remarkable about this book, is you could have one person who's not really that into science fiction who could totally geek out on the language issue and dilemma in this book, and someone else who's maybe not that interested in the language part, who just is going to be thrilled by the plot developments and the action from the science fiction perspective. Is that intended on your part? It feels like it sort of straddles two worlds of interest, in a sense.
Well, it wasn't intended in the sense that I didn't sit there and think, okay, now to snare the SF geeks and the non-SF geeks. Not at all. But I think, the reason I love SF and fantasy and so on, part of the reason is precisely that kind of oscillation of quite sort of quite serious, rigorous, abstract ideas and quite a kind of vivid, post-pulp narrative. So to me, that kind of simultaneous, like uncontradictory having of that cake and eating it, if you like, has always been part of my draw for the whole field. Now, I'm couldn't be more delighted if what you say is true. I mean, I very much hope that does allow people a way into the books, but my sense is that I'm not doing anything that I haven't done before, which is what I always do. Is I'm interested in these ideas, in whatever it might be, language here, political, juridical borders in the city, and at the same time I'm also interested in the kind of pulp appurtenances and the monsters and all that stuff. As I say, not a kind of conscious strategy, but something that I would, I very much hope is the case, and I do want to be read as widely as possible. And so I although I would never disavow my generic tradition, I'm always very flattered when someone says, I never normally read science fiction, but I like your stuff. Now, I'm not going to turn around and say, well, great, I don't want anything to do with that science fiction muck either, because this is the field I love and I come out of. But I'm also not embarrassed to say that, of course, I want to be read as widely as possible, and that means not just traditional readers of SF.
In case you just tuned in, you're listening to Between the Covers, and we're talking today with China Miéville. China, why don't we have you read a little section of Embassytown for our listeners today?
Sure. This is a very, very short moment, just the opening 2 paragraphs from an early section of Embassytown. When we were young in Embassytown, we played a game with coins and coin-sized crescent offcuts from a workshop. We always did so in the same place, by a particular house, beyond the Rialto, in a steep sloping back street of tenements where advertisements turned in colours under the ivy. We played in the smothered light of those old screens, by a wall we christened for the tokens we played with. I remember spinning a heavy 2-sou piece on its edge and chanting as it went, turnabout, incline, pig snout, sunshine, until it wobbled and fell. The face that showed, and the word I'd reached when the motion stopped, would combine to specify some reward or forfeit. I see myself clearly in wet spring and in summer, with a deuce in my hand, arguing over interpretations with other girls and with boys. We would never have played elsewhere, though that house, about which and about the inhabitant of which there were stories, could make us uneasy.
That's very evocative. I wanted to ask you a question about craft. And it seems like in a lot of your books, you don't do a lot of backstory at the beginning. You plunge people into this new world and sort of demand of the reader to piece it together as they go and to engage with the words. And I can say for myself that I find that when it finally clicks in, when you've gotten to the point where all of a sudden everything starts to make sense and sink in, it is actually quite rewarding. And I was wondering if that craft decision to not sort of world build at the beginning with some sort of exposition, but to throw people into the scene, is that at all connected to your wish to parse out these disconnects of communication between peoples at the same time? Because in a sense, there's a disconnect at the beginning between the writer and the reader that then merges as you get farther into the book.
Not at a conscious level, no. I mean, I think what it is more a question of. In fact, I think there's something quite fruitful about that disconnect. That it's not something to be within the kind of formal level of the writing, the kind of fairly sort of deep end kind of jumping in points. It's something I think that if I do my job right, which is a separate question, but if I do it right, it allows you a certain kind of immersion which a more kind of sedate world building doesn't do, which is basically culture shock. And I'm really interested not only in culture shock as a sort of as a thematic, but in trying to kind of create a sense of culture shock among readers. And I really like the idea of a reader. I can only speak for myself, but I very much like and always liked books in which I felt like I'd just got off the wrong aeroplane. I didn't know what was going on, and I trusted the writer to sort of slowly unfold, not even necessarily everything, but enough that I could stumble my way through the streets of wherever I was. And that sense that I think there's paradoxically more of a sense of totality and a kind of vivid world when you don't feel like you know what's going on. Whereas if you kind of ploddingly talk people through everything, it becomes much more a question of sort of plot coupons than a sense of inhabiting, falling into an imagined landscape. And the whole point of that imaginary world, the fantastic for me, is about that moment of estrangement. So I love that idea of culture shock being a kind of productive a kind of productive hermeneutic, if you like.
There's also a way in Embassytown and how you describe the different alien species and structures where you give some description, but it feels like the things aren't entirely fully described. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I actually see it as a way in which it adds a sense of mystery, but also a way for the reader's imagination to stretch forward into the words. And is that actually an intentional technique on your part? Yeah,
in this particular book it was. I mean, most of my earlier books, the Baslag books and various others, operated on a very different logic, whereby these things were quite carefully described, so that the way that estrangement was I attempted to sort of kind of inculcate it was by a kind of quite meticulous itemization of the impossible, whereas with this, because it is written in the first person as the kind of memoir of somebody who inhabits a world that she takes for granted, there's very much not that kind of walking through the specifics, that you have to kind of, I hope, sort of glean your own sense of what these things look like and so on, sort of behind the backs of the words themselves. And that was partly because thematically it is related to the whole question of language in the book and its limits, and partly again something to do with that culture shock thing that we were talking about, whereby this is her world. She is no more bothering to describe it than you are bothering to describe, your favourite Portland bagel shop, and yet if you've never seen a bagel shop before, that's going to be a really strange thing, you know what I mean? So that was and that is, I wouldn't say it's a departure exactly, but that felt like something I was trying to stress in this book much more so than in the others, so that sense of withholding was quite deliberate.
So we often hear when in your books, which I think are very interesting in the sense that they're both reviewed by mainstream publications, the New York Times or the Guardian, and also by genre publications. You often hear the purported compliment that you are transcending the genre, and I've read places where you maybe bristle at that a little bit and where the genre is a badge of honor. And I know that Ursula K, who lives here in Portland, she has campaigned a lot for the respectability of science fiction, and even in her review of this book had talked about how she would hope that someday you'd win the Booker, and then the whole literary hierarchy would sort of crumble in its silliness. Can you talk about that debate? Is that something that interests you, or what do you think about these people who are talking about you transcending genre in a positive way?
Well, as you say, it's normally meant very kindly. It's meant as a compliment, and so I think it would be a little bit devish to get really snippy about it. But what I would tend to sort of say is, thank you very much. I'm very glad you like the book, but I actually don't think it's transcending genre. I think it is very much a product of a set of genre protocols, and that actually what I think, between you and me, this is me talking to you now, not me talking to our imagined interlocutor. I think what people are saying when they say something like that is, I liked this book, and I know by my own self-definition that I am not a reader of science fiction, ergo, this cannot be a science fiction book. And I would want to kind of gently prod away at that and sort of say, actually probably what's more rigorous is the notion that you accidentally liked the science fiction book, and maybe you might like others too. The stuff that Le Guin said was, ridiculously lovely and terribly moving to me, but there is a serious issue about, these kind of ongoing endless debates about genre. I'm really interested in genres. I like separate literary traditions. I like the notion of genre as a kind of engine, a set of, I wouldn't say rules, I would say protocols, a set of traditions, a set of understandings and thematics, and I find them fascinating. So I'm not someone who says there's no such thing as genre, there's just good books and bad books. I think that's actually unhelpful, because I think there are specificities to, not hard and rigid, but specificities to the tradition of SF, to the tradition of crime, romance, and indeed, the genre that we now think of, many of us, as literary fiction, which is a terrible, terrible name for what is essentially in much of its product, a genre. So, I think there is a kind of very unrigorous, unthought out approach to this question in a lot of these discussions, normally from people who think of themselves as not being interested in genre. And I suppose I would want to, as non-foolishly as possible, sort of say, actually, I don't think that's really a rigorous way of thinking about it, and I don't think genre is anything to be scared of, and I think it is a not unuseful way to think about books. It's not the only way, doesn't end the conversation, but I also think you can get at things with it that you can't get any other things. The one caveat I'd want to add on all this is that we in the kind of geek world moan about this all the time, and I'm really bored of hearing us moan about it. And we're not wrong. The snobbery is very annoying, but it would be really nice if we had the self-confidence to sort of not even rise above it, but kind of pick our fights a little bit and stuff. So I think it is a real issue, but I also think sometimes we don't help ourselves by a certain sense of investment in our own embattledness.
Well, you mentioned that science fiction and other genres have some advantages over literary fiction. And turning that around and looking at some of them, what would you consider the advantage of writing from the science fiction perspective?
Well, I think most of the time what I would say is that, I would try to be very kind of ecumenical and open-minded, and I would say that different generic traditions have different sets of tools that allow you to do different things, and not, one is not better than the other, they're just different, and they might be complementary, and I would say all that, and I would mean it as far as it goes. But the truth is, there is also a part of me that thinks on some level, I don't want to overstate it, but I have a sense, I have an intuition that there is something specific about the fantastic which does get at the world in a way that the supposedly realistic does not. So I think, the project of realism, the notion, and I don't say, there are plenty of wonderful realist novels, let's not be foolish about this, but the notion that somehow you can represent reality in this highly artificial form and that you are in some way really reflecting or representing reality is very strange. It's a very strange project. Whereas it seems to me a kind of self-conscious embracing of the notion that there is something dreamed up and fantasticated about that kind of refraction of the real world. It's not reflected, it's refracted, means that you can kind of pick at the skin of the real world better on some level with the tools of the fantastic than you can with non-fantastic tools. And there's been a whole body of theory and writing that kind of goes down this route. I say it tentatively because it's more of an intuition than a rigorous position, but if I'm honest, I do have that sense. There is supposedly a quote where Adorno said that Kafka was the only writer capable of writing about the 20th century. And I think if Kafka had not written about, if we think there's any mileage at all to that, then it is something to do with the fact that Kafka is describing somebody waking up as a giant cockroach. That's writing about the 20th century in a way that, had he been writing realist novels about the life of a neurotic Jewish clerk in Prague, he would not have quite been doing so well.
So with your body of work, and when people go back to the idea of genre categories, and you've now done a science fiction book, you've done fantasy, you've done detective, noir fiction, but yet you sometimes describe your work as weird fiction. Perhaps all of those are falling under that umbrella. Can you describe what you mean by weird fiction and where you would place yourself in that way, and maybe give some good examples so people are like, oh, what's weird fiction, and what other books could I read that are weird fiction?
Well, that was weird fiction was a term that I borrowed from the tradition most obviously associated with writers like H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith and Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood and William Hope Hodgson and others, which is essentially the reason, writing from kind of the 1890s through to the 1930s. But the reason I like it is because it was a tradition that stressed the grotesque, but that also had a kind of blurry line between the fantastic and the science fictional, which is a division that some people are very invested in, and that others of us, like myself, think is certainly at a kind of rigorous level a spurious distinction. I don't buy it. And so something about a tradition that really kind of glories in that kind of blurriness, it was very attractive to me, very appealing. So that was one of the reasons that I kind of really enjoyed using that term. And I think if I were starting now and I were writing something like Embassytown, it doesn't feel to me as overtly weird as the Bas Lag books, for example. But I do like that term, weird fiction, and so it is still something I'm quite happy to kind of cop to and defend, always with the caveat that these things are always, performances and not vague, but sort of fuzzy, fuzzy edges. So that was where it kind of came from, partly a homage to these writers, partly a critique of these writers, and partly a kind of engagement with the always already blurriness of genres.
Just to switch the topic a little bit, we, as an active member of the Socialist Party in England, I was curious if socialism, I mean, our station is definitely a left-leaning station, and our listeners might be interested to know if socialism plays any sort of role in your world building. It's obvious to me as a reader that it's not that you don't have some sort of agenda of like some heavy-handed allegory regarding socialism. But does it play a role when you're thinking of class struggles or other ways in which you try to imagine the power dynamic when you build a new universe or a new world?
Well, I mean, there's no question that sometimes, I will think, like the way I depict a strike, for example, is, informed by the way I understand strikes, which is, through the prism of my politics and so on. I mean, there's no secret about that, So I don't want to suggest that, sometimes the politics becomes quite overt if it is relevant for that narrative. So Iron Council is very explicitly political because the narrative itself is driven by political events. It's about a political, revolution. But I think sometimes when people pose the question, I'm not saying you didn't do this, but there is a sense sometimes in the question, how do your politics and your writing, that there's like this notion of there's the writer, and then there's the politics is a separate thing, and then there's the fiction is a separate thing, and like how do these two things interact? It's all much more like all the stuff I'm interested in is thrown into the washing machine that is my brain, and it's put on spin. And then when you're trying to construct stuff, you reach in and you pull the stuff out, and of course it's all mixed up. That's not a problem. That's the way you create stuff, and it means, so the question of is it conscious or unconscious, in some ways not really a kind of germane question. Of course I'm conscious that the way I think about the world is political, but it is not a sort of cunning plan to smuggle stuff in. When Gene Wolfe writes about the world, the way he thinks about the world is heavily Catholic, because he's a very devoutly Catholic writer, and those themes are absolutely there. You don't have to agree with them, you don't have to disagree with them to admire the works of art very much. So to me, it simply doesn't come up as an issue to negotiate. There's never any negotiation involved.
So for China Miéville fans, about wondering what's going to come out of the washing machine that's your brain next, are we going to expect another jump in genre next book?
I hope so. I like mixing and matching and trying to do different things and so on, but I'm afraid I'm going to be really evasive because I'm quite superstitious about talking about work in progress. So I will say that I've got something that's nearly finished and that I'm doing the kind of big edit on now, and so hopefully we'll be out round about this time next year. But I think nothing could be more asking for trouble than to announce to the universe what it's about and the way it's written and so on, because there's the old, there's the Yiddish joke about how do you make God laugh, tell God your plans. So I feel a little bit like that about work in progress.
Well, it was a pleasure having you on Between the Covers today, China, and best of luck with Embassytown.
Thank you very much for having me.